The Awakening, from the Fempiror Chronicles, by George Willson. Chapter 20. Homecoming. The sun was well below the horizon by the time David reached Hogginstown on the chaser. He looked at the town as he passed, hoping this task was something he could actually do, and he hoped that it would help Beth to move on as well. He rode toward the old mill in the east, where all this had truly begun for him. He rode around the mill to the cave where he had found Ben that night. He was not sure how many people in Hogginstown knew about this cave, but since it was coming on tonight, he doubted anyone would disturb the chaser if he left it there for a little while. Then again, even if they did find it, they would have no idea what to do with it. He stopped easily inside the cave and turned off the chaser. It lowered to the ground, setting itself on small legs permanently attached to the bottom of the vehicle. David removed his day-travel cloak and laid it on the seat of the chaser, as the small vehicle had no place to stow even this item. David looked into the darkness at the back of the cave, where Ben and his captor rested not so long ago, and wondered if Ben was still there. He knew that Zechariah had killed the Fempiror who had changed him, and that this person's declaration of being a member of the Tepish order had placed Zechariah's own quest into motion. He was short on time, however. That Olewo had seen him leave, and would be telling Ulrich and Zechariah about it as soon as their fight was done, so he had to move. He walked out of the cave onto familiar ground again, and for the first time in several days, he knew exactly where he was. Familiar air blew against his face, although it felt hotter now that he was colder. He jogged across the fields towards the place he had dreamed of leaving not so long ago, and now that his new life forced him to leave it, he wanted nothing more than to return. His mind raced with what he would say, how he would explain this to her. He slowed to a walk, and passing around the shops on the south end of town, his feet touched the road that led past his father's store and the Wits' End Tavern, now resting dark in the moonlight. He had considered approaching Beth's house without ever going through town, but since he would never see Hogginstown again, he felt the need to walk through it one last time. He looked around and saw no one stirring in the town, though several windows showed light behind the curtains. He figured they must have done a total lockdown at night when he disappeared. This was a welcome sight, though, since it would allow him to get to Beth's house unnoticed. He was unsure how he would explain himself to anyone else he ran into. He knew they would be worried about him, but he was not going to be able to stay here very long, so he would not have the time to explain his situation to everyone who might need to know. Beth would have to deliver the message if she chose to tomorrow. He crossed the grassy square around the statue of Gerald Hoggins. He recalled vividly the face of the Tepish stopping him, and the searing pain of the Neorof as it forced the poisonous blood into his veins. This was his birthplace into this new life, where at another time he had disobeyed a directive, and it had gone ill for him. He considered with a certain irony that he was disobeying another directive, and had ended up at this same place. But this time, it would not end with anyone's life being lost. "David?" a voice said from beside the statue. David froze and looked to the source of the voice, which he recognized at once. Abraham Barber stood in the rising moonlight, staring at David through shocked eyes. Abraham looked frightened, more than any other expression, which surprised David, since his reappearance after having simply disappeared should have elicited a more positive response. David smiled at the sight of his friend, though, since this allowed him to see both of his dearest friends before he would leave them forever. "Abraham," David said. They ran towards each other and embraced, laughing with joy at seeing each other again. Abraham broke first and took a step back, suddenly concerned. "My God, you are cold," he said. The observation came as no surprise to David, but he did not know how he felt to other people. He knew he was colder, and he felt how warm Abraham was compared to him. David finally just nodded. "It's a long story," he said. "What happened to you?" Abraham asked excitedly. "Where have you been?" "I've been changed," David replied. "I can't explain everything. It's too much." Abraham looked confused. "Changed?" he said. "I don't understand." David did not want to spend a lot of time explaining this to Abraham when his time was so limited. "Physically, I'm different," he said, and hastily added when Abraham continued to look concerned, "But I'm still the same person you've always known." "Physically different?" Abraham asked, locking on to the point of David's change. David saw no point in hiding the bottom line from his friend. "I'm a Fempiror," David said, knowing Abraham would never have heard the word before, and would not know what it meant either. "We're stronger, faster, and live much longer than regular humans." He considered that he should not have referenced to non-Fempiror as regular humans, since that really separated him from Abraham and the rest of the town, and Abraham would not understand this at all. Yet maybe it would help his imminent departure if he emphasized how different he was. "Regular humans? You mean me?" Abraham clarified, hitting the point dead on. "Yes," David said. "I'm not like you. Not anymore." Abraham's stance changed noticeably. He no longer had the openness he had shown when he had first seen David. Now he looked like someone confronting a stranger. "What are you doing here?" he asked, and again David had no reason to hide his purpose. "I want to talk to Beth," he said. "Why?" Abraham asked as he moved to block David's path toward Beth's house. David considered that this might be more difficult than he originally thought, but he also did not plan on meeting anyone, especially Abraham. "It's personal," David said. David saw that Abraham was not going to be receptive to him, just as Zechariah had said. He had told the truth to his closest friend, and Abraham's reaction proved that Zechariah was right. He needed to talk to Beth and leave Hogginstown forever. "You need to tell me why," Abraham insisted. "It doesn't concern you," David replied. "Pardon me, David," Abraham said, "but we buried you yesterday, and I would like to know why you want to see Beth, especially if you're no longer like me. What are your intentions?" David blinked. "Buried him yesterday?" That would explain Abraham's surprise at his return, but whom did they bury? There was only one explanation: the Tepesh. They had found what remained of the Tepesh at sunrise, and assumed it was David. He looked back at Abraham. "I know this is a surprise, and I'm not going to stay. I just want to talk to her." "You don't belong here anymore," Abraham clarified. "You are now what this town has been hunting for to atone for your death and that of old Ben, aren't you? Who is buried in your grave?" "The one who changed me, I suppose," David said with a shrug. "How do I know you didn't kill him?" Abraham asked. This was a confusing point. After all, Zechariah had killed that Tepesh because of him, but now Abraham was going to try David for the punishment of a capital crime in another society? It was all too much to consider at the moment, especially when he was bound to have some angry Fempiror on his tail at any moment. "I have killed no one. Why would I?" David said. "But I can't trust you," Abraham declared. "Abraham," David pleaded, "I am the same David you've known all your life." "No, you're not," Abraham insisted. "You're cold. You disappeared, and now you come back and say you're different. How can you be the same and different?" "I don't have time for this right now," David said, and walked around Abraham towards Beth's house. Abraham reached out and grabbed David by the arm. David stopped and looked at him. "I'm not letting you get close to her," Abraham said. David looked at Abraham with as much compassion as he had within him. "I don't want to hurt you," David said. Abraham tried to throw a punch at David, but David dodged the blow more easily than he ever thought possible. He pushed Abraham down. David walked toward Beth's house again, but Abraham jumped in his way, trying to hold him back. David lifted Abraham off the ground and tossed him against the base of the statue. Abraham remained unmoving where he had landed. David never intended that. He ran to his friend's side and knelt beside him. Abraham was still breathing, so David did not kill him. He saw a tear run down Abraham's face to the ground. David touched his face gently, a great sadness filling him from within. "Forgive me, old friend," David said softly. He rose to his feet and walked swiftly towards Beth's house again, hoping the rest of the night would go more smoothly. He approached her house and walked around to the north side where her room was. The house was dark, but her window was open. He considered whether he should knock first, but his appearance would be enough of a shock, especially since they think he is dead and buried. He climbed in through her window. He looked around her bedroom to the collection of family items she had, from clothes to the painting she had started earlier this year. She said she had to leave his face off until they announced themselves, and at the time they had not made any plans. He had only been here once before, and had also entered through the window, since a boy's presence in a girl's bedroom was very much frowned upon. Looking at the painting again, she had finished it with his face. Had she done it that night? Perhaps she had done it after he died, to make sure she remembered him. It was perfect. He looked to her bed, and saw her sleeping on her side on top of the bedclothes. She was not dressed in nightclothes, however, and he wondered if that was part of her mourning. She wore the dress that she had worn the night he was changed. It was a simple work of her own design for the summer, in soft shades of blue and white. She had shown it off to his father and mother, and they declared that she had all the skills of a tailor. It was to be ironic she was going to join their family one day, but those dreams were now in the past. He looked at her sleeping face in the dim light coming in through the window. Her eyes were red and puffy. It looked like she had cried herself to sleep. He touched her pillow, and it was wet to the touch, proving his idea correctly. It broke his heart to see her this way, and he almost left immediately. Would this meeting really help her, or would it set her back again? Perhaps it would be a comfort to her that he was alive, he thought. That thought was enough to drive him forward to what he came here to do. "Beth," he said softly, maintaining his stance near her. Her eyes shot open and looked up at him. She looked frightened. "Who are you?" she said in a whisper more of fright than secrecy. He leaned in closer to her. She studied his face. Recognition slowly came into her eyes. She touched his face with her hands. Her breathing quickened. Tears came to her eyes. A smile broke on her face. "David?" she said softly. With a joyful gasp, she leaped out of bed into his arms. He held her weight easily as she buried her face into his. They kissed more passionately than they had ever done before. All the fears he had harbored were gone in an instant, and all the words and cautions of Zechariah melted away in the gentle moonlight and the warmth of her lips against his. "David," she said before kissing him again, "my dear David, what happened to you?" Then concern pierced her brow as she noticed she was still off the ground in his arms, and he was not struggling at all. She lowered her feet, and he released her gently to the floor. "Why are you so cold?" she asked. "It's a long story," David said. A snore echoed through the house from her parents' bedroom. "Will you come with me?" he asked. "We can talk elsewhere." She looked at him sidelong. "Is it safe?" she asked. And David said the one thing he knew he could promise. "I'll protect you."